Welcome back to the course. We're still in lesson 3, and in this video we're going to learn how to separate the events part from the logic part in our game loop. Now, first of all, what we're going to do is disable event repetition for a key pressed event. So if we have been holding down the A key, then this event happens again and again, and it continuously printed out to the console. We want to disable the repetition of key pressed event. So up here, when we set window.setFrameRateLimit, we're going to add another call, which is window.setKeyRepeatEnabled, and the parameter is false. So now if we run this and hold down the A key, it only prints once, and when we release it, it prints that it has been released. Now, let's get to the separation of events and logic. Till now we have been printing out in the events part of the game loop, but printing out to the console is actually a logical or rendering part of the loop. So what we want to do is move this out into the logic part of the game loop. Now, moving one line like this may seem silly, but we have to get used to separating events from logic, because when we start doing more complex things like movement, we really want that the actual movement happens in the logic part of the loop, and the event for a key pressed for moving left happens in the events. Picture this: if the logic to move the player to the left would be in the events part, and we would have an event for pressing down the left key, then the player would move left only at that frame at which the key has been pressed. Even though we are still holding the key down, the player wouldn't move because the event wouldn't happen. So we want to have logic in the logic part, which gets called every frame, and we want that the events only set so-called states. So we want a state that is true if the A key is pressed down and if it's released, and then we do logic dependent on that. So what we're going to do is create two variables, Boolean variables, so that we can set them in the events part and do logic in the logic part. So let's first create the state for the first event. So the A key pressed. So let's create a variable. The variable has to be before the game loop because we're going to use it all the time. So we create a bool, let's name it A pressed, and set it to false. And then when the actual event happens, we set A pressed to true. Now we have saved that the A key has been pressed. So let's move out this logic, which is printing out to the console, and let's make it that in the logic part, that if the state of A pressed is true, meaning that the event has happened, we print out to the console. So if A pressed is equal to true, print out to the console. And because we don't want to continuously repeat that the A key has been pressed because the state is true, we want to, after we have printed out to the console, we want to set it to false, so that in the next frame we won't print out again. So if we run this, then our program is going to run the same as it did on the start. So I press down A, hold it, and release it, and it does the same. But now we actually have events separated from logic. So let's do the same for the A released event. We need another variable. Let's name it A release, and at the start we set it to false, so that's not true. When the actual event happens, we set A released to false. And now we can move the printout to the logic part. Printing out to the console is a logic part because it's not rendering, because rendering is when we draw things in the window and not at the console. So in the logic part we have another if, and now if A released is equal to true, so meaning that the event has happened, we print out to the console. And we set A released to false so that we don't print out in the next frame. So if we run this, hold down A and release A, it doesn't work. So we missed something. Oh, we have set A released to false when the event happened. So let's fix that. So we put it to true. Now everything should work as intended. So I hold on A, it says A has been pressed, and when I release it, it says A has been released. And it works. Now for the close event, we don't have to separate from the logic from the event part, because we set the play variable to false, which will close the game loop and close our program. So we don't really have to care if this is not separated, because it will actually close the game. Let's just remove the A release to false statement so that you can see what happens if we don't set it back to false. Now what will happen is, once we release the A key, the state is going to be true, and it's going to print out the A key has been released every frame. This is just something that you see what actually happens. So now we have released the A key, and as you can see, it prints out all the time. So let's make it back. Now this is the basic of separating events from the logic part. We could do another one which resembles something like movement, where we only have one state for a key. Here we had two states. One was for a once event of A being pressed down and an A being released. Now we want to have a variable which is true when the key is pressed and false when the key is released. Let's name it space, because we're going to use the space key. And at the start, the space key is released. Now you have to create the events. And I'm just going to copy the events for A key because they're basically the same. I only have to change the event.keycode to SF keyboard space, and do the same at the release event. And in those events, we want to set, in the key pressed event, we want to set space to true, and in the key released, we want to set space to false. Meaning that when the key is pressed, the state shows that the key is true or pressed down, and when the event for key release happens, the space key state is set to false, meaning that it's not pressed down. Now in the logic part, we simply have to write logic what should happen when the key space is pressed down and when it's not. So first let's make when space is true, meaning that the space key is pressed down. So if space is equal to true, we want to print out, so std double colon cout left equivalent And let's just print out space and a new line. And when space is equal to false, meaning that it's not pressed down, so if space is equal to false, we print out, let's say, not space. Now, as you can see, this is going to happen every frame. So it's going to print out every frame either space or not space. This is something that resembles movement. We either do move or don't move every frame. So if we run this, first going to write not space all the time, and when we press down space, it prints space all the time. And then if we press A key, you can see in between it prints out for the A key. So these are the basics of how we separate events from logic. And you should try that you always separate logic from events. The only one exception is when you actually close the game, because then it's not really required to separate them. So this is all for this video. In the next video we're going to cover most events and movement, and then we're basically done with events. Thanks for listening.